My name is Dr. Ken Sikaris, and I'm giving this lecture on reference intervals for the European Federation of Laboratory Medicine. It's an ambitious topic. There's quite a lot of complexity to reference intervals, and I hope to cover most of that, at least to give you an understanding of the complexity. So I've been a chemical pathologist or clinical chemist for 30 years. I've held national and international positions in analytical quality and reference intervals, and I'm an examiner in Australia. I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose, except that I am Greek, and like the Pythagoreans, I do fancy that the principles of mathematics are the principle of all things. The Pythagoras' theorem has an unusually surprising relevance to the topic today. So I hope we can understand the statistical basis of reference intervals, what it takes to establish reference intervals and verify reference intervals. So you should understand the Gaussian intervals and those issues. Now, Johann Gauss was a German mathematician who first describes the mathematical nature of the Gaussian interval, which is really the statistical basis for most reference interval studies. I'll start off with talking about the binomial distribution. So if you toss a coin, the distribution would be one head or no heads. If you toss two coins, you tend to get one head and one tail, but you can get no heads or you can get two heads. And so on. With 3 coins, there's a different distribution, 4 coins, 5 coins, and so on. Now you'll notice when you get to 10 coins, the most likely thing is you get 5 heads and 5 tails, but then you can get all of those variations around, and that shape starts to resemble the Gaussian distribution. But if we toss more coins, let's say 20 coins, you can start really seeing that shape of the Gaussian interval. So the binomial distribution becomes the Gaussian interval when there are at least 20 factors. Now we can progress from that point and 50 coins or 100 coins or 250 coins. And now it's very, very similar to the Gaussian interval. And you can see also from this that it's very unlikely you'll get less than 100 heads or more than 150 heads. Very unlikely by chance alone. So effectively, by the time we toss 20 coins, we're not gaining any more in the shape of the kurtosis of the binomial curve compared to the Gaussian curve, which to me means that 20 factors can describe how things vary in the reference interval. And so you can probably think of 20 things that affect sodium or potassium or glucose. And that's why the reference interval has that shape, because there are so many physiological and environmental factors that affect the level of an analyte. Now, a deeper interest in the Gaussian interval. So that's the Gaussian distribution. Now, the cumulative distribution, so 50% of the results will be by the median and 100% by the time you get out to 3 or 4 SDs. 68% of results rely between -1 to +1 SDs. And we often talk about plus or minus 2 SDs as 95%, but it's actually 95.5%. Or if you like, 1.96 SDs is 95%. Now, I point that out just to be pedantic because there's no difference. We can't tell the difference between 2 and 1.96 SDs. So you can say 2 SDs is 95%, and that would be acceptable. Now, some other characteristics of this is if you look at the slope of the cumulative distribution, the slope is positive at the beginning, then it becomes a 0, and then it becomes negative. So if we look at that slope of the reference interval, it has a sigmoid shape like that. Now, another way to look at it is the ratio frequencies. So here the ratio is positive. That frequency is higher than the other frequency. And on the other side of the curve, it's negative. That part of the that frequency is lower than that other frequency. So if we look at the ratio of the distribution rather than the slope, it has this shape. And so it goes through a ratio of 1 at the median. Now, the other thing you can do is take the logarithm of that ratio, and surprise, surprise, the logarithm of that ratio forms a straight line. And that essentially is what the Bhattacharya function is, which we'll talk about soon. So it's a way of linearizing the reference interval, if you like. Now, Bhattacharya was a statistician in India, looked at different sizes of fish as they were released from the fisheries, and he could tell how many fish were in one year's release or the next year's release by looking at those overlapping intervals using that Bhattacharya principle. Hoffman is somebody else that looked at that linearization of the Gaussian interval through a probit plot. But people pointed out that although he made the assumption that all distributions were Gaussian, people generally found that the distributions of analytes is usually not Gaussian. Now, Quetelet, a Belgian statistician, was one of the first to describe, over 100 years ago, almost 200 years ago, that human characteristics were distributed in a Gaussian fashion. And here we have the height of people, height of men, and the height of women being Gaussianly distributed. But, if you combine those together, there's an overlapping distribution, which is not purely Gaussian. It's a broadened distribution. So more recently, people have tried to disentangle the distribution of Americans into men and women, and you can use computer programs to separate the underlying Gaussian intervals, just as Quetelet did. Now, I'll talk about indirect methods later in the talk, but nowadays there are very advanced techniques of trying to work out what the underlying intervals are and what overlapping factors may be there. But essentially, you can belong to one of two camps. The Quetelet camp, which believes that everything is Gaussian or Pythagorean, and or the anti-Quetelet that believes nothing is Gaussian and everything needs transformations. In 1951, when Wooten first described the normal distribution, he said that virtually all of them are normal or Gaussian, and the others were log Gaussian. Now, why do we need reference intervals? Well, when a doctor gets a report like this 32-week pregnant woman, if they look at the results from the laboratory, they wouldn't be able to work out whether there's anything wrong without having a reference interval, and in particular, without having the abnormal results flagged. So the flagging, according to reference intervals, is essentially how clinicians look at pathology results. So the power of the asterisk or this highlighting, the reference interval is what helps physicians interpret patient results. Whether that's right or wrong, that's what happens. So the reference interval. Now you'll see a whole lot of other names for the reference interval. Decision limits, cutoffs, and so on. Now the proper term is reference interval and the wrong term is normal range. Now I'll come back to that. 1975, William Sunderman said that normal is really a misleading and ambiguous term. So does normal mean healthy? Does normal mean Gaussian, as in a normal curve? Does normal mean ideal? And if you're not in that normal range, does that mean you're automatically abnormal? So people have really said that the idea of normal values should be abolished because it's so ambiguous and misleading. So later in 1979, the IFCC committee led by Grasbeck and Siest really came up with a new terminology to do with not normal ranges, but reference intervals. And that's the terminology we use in the international standard for defining reference intervals. And in the ISO 15189 standard for laboratories, it says that reference interval is the right term, and this supersedes the incorrect term such as normal range. So please don't use normal range. Don't even use reference range. ISO 15189 says laboratories should have reference intervals. They should be reviewed, especially when you change methods, and that a report should include the reference intervals to allow interpretation. Now, why not reference range? Now, when you have a series of reference values from a reference interval studies, the reference range is the range from the lowest result to the highest result. And it's really determined by the outliers. If by chance you had to get an even lower outlier, the reference range would vary simply according to the outliers. And that's too variable for our clinical purpose. So the reference limit, being the central 95% of the distribution, is far more constant. A single outlier or two won't affect that reference limit. And so that is the reference interval. And it's very different to the reference range. It lies between those two pillars, which is the Latin derivation of interval. So if you get some reference individuals, apparently healthy, they form the reference population. We select a sample of them for a reference interval study. We get their values. They form a distribution. We can define the reference limits which border the reference intervals. And then we can have a patient results which we can compare with the reference values or the reference intervals, whichever you would prefer to call. So here's the healthy reference interval, Gaussian reference interval. And the assumption is that if your results aren't in that range or that interval, then you're unlikely to be healthy. But that's an assumption. All we've done is define health. Now, in this example from Gerard Siest, he talked about how the reference interval can be related to clinical management. So normally a patient would oscillate within the reference interval, and everyone has their own oscillation point, as we've discussed. Or a patient may drift out of the reference interval, develop a disease, be managed, and so on. So in screening, we are interested in whether people move towards or outside the reference interval. In diagnosing, we were trying to see whether people are consistently outside the reference interval and in a diseased range. In prognosis, we see whether they're responding to treatment. Are they heading back towards the reference interval? And monitoring will tell you whether they're moving further away from health. Now, in the ideal situation, the reference interval would tell us where, distinguish health and disease. But in reality, there's never that clear distinction in our laboratory tests. There's an overlap. Now, if we prioritize specificity and we know that there's an overlap, what happens? So when there's an overlap and there's diseased people in the upper part of the reference interval, then what happens is that we miss those early diseased patients. And that's not ideal. We prioritize specificity, we miss early disease. Now, reference intervals can be used when there's no clinical decision limits available to define disease, but reference intervals should not be used as decision limits. Like if you're above the reference interval, you don't have the disease, and if you're within, you do have the disease. That's wrong, and that's a misuse. What about if we try to focus on not missing disease then? When there's an overlap and we prioritise sensitivity, the problem is we've labelled a lot of healthy people as potentially having the disease. Now, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. What's worse, telling people who are well that they've got disease, or telling people with disease that they're well? So, we can prioritise sensitivity or specificity. Maybe the answer is just to pick a cutoff in between those two, the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds. Now, that's what the receiver operating curve does. So you can either choose a low cutoff, which has high sensitivity, or a high cutoff, which has high specificity, or choose something close to that top corner, which is the balance of sensitivity and specificity. I think that's a good thing to do when you don't know what you're doing, trying to rule out health or rule in disease. If you don't know what you're doing, use this RAC curve. So reference intervals are to do with unaffected or apparently healthy people, and clinical decision limits are to do with disease and clinical conditions and clinical management. This review by the IFCC Committee on Reference Intervals and Decision Limits sort of describes the important distinction between those two things. Now, what's better, reference interval or clinical decision limit? Now, I'll take you back to 1999 when we had a meeting to try to work out what is quality in laboratory medicine. And they came up with a hierarchy, which was to do with the best way to define quality is whether you're beneficially affecting clinical outcome. And the worst way of affecting quality is just to do what everyone else does, the state of the art. Now, I won't go into details. I did try to, in this paper, assign those 5 Stockholm levels to different reference intervals, but we don't need to do that because 15 years later, in 2014 in Milan, there was a second meeting, and many of the people that I mentioned during this talk were at that meeting, and we did address things like post-analytical quality or the quality of reference intervals and interpretation. So in the Milan hierarchy, there's 3, not levels, but 3 models: clinical outcome, biological variation, and state of the art. So let's have a look at how they relate to reference intervals and decision limits. First of all, state of the art. That's doing whatever everyone else does. So what's the state of the art like? Well, it's terrible. We know that laboratories vary in reference intervals that they have on their methods, despite the fact they're using the same methods in the same country. So here's an example in Germany where the upper reference interval for potassium in 2003 varied from 4.5 to 5.6, and the lower limit varied from 3.3 to 3.9. And that wasn't because the methods were biased. In Australia and New Zealand, in the IMEP study, they found that with sodium concentration, yes, sodium concentration varies slightly with methods, but reference intervals varied even more. So generally, reference intervals vary far more than analytical variation would allow. And in this study to do with thyroid function, they found no relationship between analytical bias and the reference interval bias. So, anybody who thinks that laboratories, if their laboratories are reporting higher reference intervals because they've got a biased method, that's a hope, really. Graham Jones also analysed the data and found that here is the typical CVs for these assays, and here is the typical CVs of the upper and lower reference limit. And they're far greater, at least twice as high. George Simbrowski in Canada did the same thing and looked at the CV of the highest and lowest of the upper reference limit. Some things are fairly tight, sodium osmolality, as they should be, but some things are terribly broad compared to what analytical variation for these assays of 5 to 10% typically. So where do people get all these varying reference intervals from? Well, we found that when we were looking at testo reference interval, equal thirds of Australian labs said that they got them from the kit insert, an in-house study, or from a textbook. in the UK, they found that FSH and LH intervals that were either from the manufacturer, in-house study, or the literature, a variety of sources for the same methods. And in this CAP probe in the US, they found that, internal studies were more common than manufacturers' insert and textbooks, which I find surprising because I thought the FDA would have held sway. Now, that variation in reference intervals means the most common cause of disease is upper limit syndromes. We cause disease, or record apparent, disease by having reference intervals that vary inappropriately. So that's the fallacy. You do not use reference intervals to define disease. If that was true, then the more people you test, the more disease you'll find, just because 2.5% of people will always have an abnormal result, even though they're actually normal. So, the probability of one test is normal is 95%, but the more tests you do, the chances of getting all tests normal diminishes according to that exponent. And so here is the, if you do 20 tests, only 36% will have all of those 20 tests as normal. And so really the saying is true that, there's no such thing as a healthy patient, only one that hasn't had enough tests. If you have 100 tests, you won't find anybody with every one of the 100 tests being normal, the way we define the reference intervals. So, and, really more than half of the abnormal results from laboratory tests ordered by GPs, where the prevalence of disease is low, tends to be false positive. And they lead to this thing called the Ulysses syndrome, where, people are, trying to investigate a patient fully to exclude disease, but all they do is increase the chance of a false positive, and that sends the patient on a long and adventurous journey. Okay, the other way of doing, rather than state of the art, what about clinical outcome? Well, clinical outcome is clinical decision limits. Clinical decision limits are ideally designed from outcome studies, and I'll show you some examples of that. Sometimes clinical decision limits come from the consensus of clinicians. So this is acknowledged in the CLSI standard, where the decision limits for cholesterol and glycated hemoglobin are used. They're not defined by what's normal, they're decided what causes disease. And so we know that 6.5% is a WHO cutoff for the definition, the establishment of the diagnosis of diabetes, because that's when the rate of retinopathy increases. But note, this is the clinical decision for diagnosing diabetes. Hemoglobin A1C can be used for other decisions. So 6.5 might be the point at which retinopathy starts, but the point at which cardiovascular disease starts is around 5.6. And many countries do have a definition of impaired A1C as a pre-diabetic state at about 5.7%, or 38 millimole per mole. So all of us should remember not to impose reference interval, no matter how well they're determined, on assays for which decision limits trump reference intervals. Decision limits are based on clinical outcome. That's what we're trying to do with the patient, to improve their clinical outcome, not just to define whether they're healthy or not. And Ferri Ceriotti, who one of the original people in the international committees on reference intervals, says that theoretical decision limits are what we really need. And he imagines that in future, decision limits will gradually replace reference intervals for most analytes. Now, that doesn't mean the reference interval doesn't have relationship to clinical outcome. So in 1951, Wooten recognised that if you're outside of 99%, well, then you could have illness. And if you're even in the top part of the reference interval, the 90th centile, then you should be viewed with suspicion. So that's within the reference interval, you may have risk. And that's true. If we look at PSA levels and what level predicts the likely death from prostate cancer, the risk of death rises at the 50th centile, at the median of the reference interval. So as your result rises away from the median of the interval, your risk of disease increases. We looked at the risk of dying according to sodium levels. How often do patients die? When patients have a sodium level of 160 in this Veterans Hospital, over half of them died during the admission. So again, the further away you get from the median, the greater your clinical risk. Not defining any disease, just that your risk has increased. And so there is a relationship between reference intervals and clinical risk, but it's not a defined clinical question. And more recently, people have looked at multiparametric risk. So again, if your red cells are low outside of the reference interval and your white cells are low, then your risk of dying is much higher than if only one were abnormal or if none were abnormal. Okay, so clinical decision limits are more important than reference intervals. So what's this model 2, biological variation? Well, that is really the subject of this talk, the reference interval studies. Now, I have to start off by warning you that although it is recommended that laboratories establish their own reference intervals with their own methods and their own populations, very few laboratories have the resources to do all the work required. Now, why is biological variation reference intervals? Because the reference interval is the sum of inter-individual, intra-individual, and analytical variation. In that sort of diagram by Gerard Siest, if we looked at a patient as they progress through disease, we can look at the distributions there. So the patient, there is an analytical variation, a patient variation, within individual variation, and between individual variation. And the reference interval is technically the sum of the square root of the sum of the squares of those variances. Told you Pythagoras would come back, even though it's a little bit more complex. So now the intra-individual variation is usually narrower than the between group variation. So people don't vary from one part of the reference interval to another. They tend to live in their own part of the reference interval. Some things are very tight, like urea, and some things are very broad, like albumin or glucose. And the index of individuality, or how individual that analyte is the CVI divided by CVG. Now, if you want to read more about that, please read Callum Fraser's book on biological variability. I've had the pleasure of meeting and lecturing with Callum many times. And here's one of his earlier papers sort of saying, with creatinine, people don't vary from one part of the reference interval to another. They vary just in their own zone. And so for creatinine, the intra-individual index is 0.32, very narrow. Now, when that index is below 0.6, reference intervals aren't much use, because a patient could vary from the bottom end of the reference interval to the top, and you wouldn't even notice that there's something going on. So using the EFLM website and the CVI and CVG figures that are there, you can work out what the index of individuality are for every common analyte. And you see these things here, which have very narrow index of individualities, reference intervals aren't much use. And you can see for many of them, we know that they're a problem. We need clinical decision limits and age and gender limits and so on. Whereas these ones up here, bicarbonate, chloride, potassium, they're good to handle with reference intervals because people can vary from broadly across the interval. Here's an example from Callum Fraser and Gowans that creatinine in urine has an index of individuality of 0.46. But if you create a reference interval or between biological variation for men and women separately, the index of individuality improves to well over 1, and suddenly a gender-related reference interval is useful. Now, the usefulness of the reference interval depends crucially on understanding the physiological difference between groups and appropriately partitioning reference intervals in order to maximize the index of individuality. That's what we've just discussed. So what about this partitioning? How can we do that? How do we know when people are different? Well, you can base it on statistics or you can base it on physiology. I want to cover those two things. The statistical approach is the Belgian statistician approach. You just do the differences and you see if there's a difference, well, then they must be different. We don't care why they're different. Why are men taller than women? I don't know whether Quetelet knew about testosterone, but he knew that they were different statistically. So Sinton was the first to say that if the means between those two populations is 25% as large as the overall reference interval, then he said you needed different reference intervals. That was the first approach. So here's the example that Harris Boyd also looked at is, what is the critical Z score for being confident there's a difference between the two groups? And it was around 25% of the SD. Now, here, clearly, when you've got such separated partitions as twice the reference interval apart, you'll get a bimodal distribution. You'll have no doubt that they need to be separated. What happens if the reference intervals are, if the partitions are one reference interval apart? You can see it's no longer bimodal. So reference intervals that are one reference interval apart look unimodal, even though they're quite broad. What about if the delta is half a reference interval apart? You could easily mistake the cumulated distribution for Gaussian, but it's not. It's quite broad still. And you can see clearly that the flag rate is going to be very different in these two populations. And then if we get to less than 0.25 of the reference interval, you can see that there's still going to be a difference in the flag rate. Very small difference in the means, but a doubling of the flag rate at the same point. So, and so on. So really the focus should be not so much on the means and how separated they are, but what the impact on the flag rate is. And the initial contention was that if the flag rate, which should be 2.5%, is over 4%, then you probably need a new partition. And Larty and Callum Fraser and Per Peterson sort of described all of that as, if the reference interval biased to the top, you'll get a low flag rate at the bottom end, and if you're biased towards the bottom, you get a high flag rate at the bottom end. And you'll find that in Callum Fraser's book, that if you've got a bias, there'll be an increase in flagging at one side and a decrease in flagging on the other side, 4.4% and 1.5% rather than 2.5% in each. So then they refined that estimate of 4.4% and 1.4%, depending on minimal, optimal, and desirable cutoffs. Because the other issue that can occur is a partition may be broader than another. The mean may be the same, but the partition may be broader, and that can cause a difference in flag rate. So when you also account for the differences in the ratio of the SDs, rather than using 3.3 and 4.4, they derived that 3.2 and 4.1 should be the distinction points. Below 3.2 is okay, above 4.1 is not okay. So in summary, in the review paper, if the percentage flag rate on the other side is between 1.8 and 3.2, that's close enough to 2.5%. You don't need to partition. If it's over 4.1, you need to partition. If it's below 0.9, you need to partition. But in these grey zones or yellow zones I've got here, it's not quite as simple. You need to consider the other issues. And that's what Ferruccio Seriotto said. In the marginal situations, the choice to combine or not should be based on clinical criteria. Now, what about the physiological approach? So this is really the Quetelet approach. We think that partitioning has known cause, or the need to partition has known causes. And that's what Martin and Goldstein said in their book on reference intervals, that skewness arises from the convolution of errors that affect the underlying physiological processes. Or as stated by Fraser, the appreciation of biological changes that occur is a necessary prerequisite to decide if stratification of reference interval according to age is necessary. You have to understand. Now, in the standard, it says you need to consider age, gender, pregnancy, fasting and non-fasting as partitioning factors. Of course, you need to understand the effects of fasting and non-fasting activity on the test that you're investigating, posture, anticoagulant, and so on, and try to control for those things. Now, in theory, separate reference intervals for general medical should not become an issue until the research studies have demonstrated a physiological basis between the population with respect to the analyte. So it's sort of saying we need to understand the physiology we're describing in the partitions. In the CLSI standard, they say similarly that reference intervals for men and women may not be justified unless they're clinically useful and well-grounded physiologically. Now, I'm going to give you an example of that. We looked at about 2 million CK levels in our laboratory, and you can see that CK levels fall during childhood. Then in men, they rise at puberty where testosterone kicks in, and then the CK levels just fall with age. So you can see there that it's necessary to partition reference interval for men according to age. What about women? Well, women don't have testosterone, so they fall and stay at a low level. And then there's something interesting that goes on back here. So what is happening at menopause? CK levels seems to rise at menopause. And I looked at the literature and people have described this for 30 or 40 years, but I don't know why. I don't know whether it's unopposed androgens or what it is that's causing that. So it's very hard for me in my laboratory to adopt a higher cutoff for CK in postmenopausal women when I don't understand the physiological cause and I'm not sure of the clinical impact. That's what the meaning of that discussion before is. Now, these books, I think books like this should be in every laboratory, because the way reference intervals change with age and gender and pregnancy have been well described over the years. There's no excuse for not understanding that for routine analytes. And also probably in the elderly, which is the most difficult population to derive proper partitions and reference intervals for, we need to be reminded that 60% of hospital beds are made up by the elderly compared to only 15% of pediatric beds. So we really do neglect the elderly in terms of that. So in this paper on indirect reference interval, I pointed out that overlap and skewness can be due to overlapping healthy partitions. So you need to consider partitioning related to pregnancy, childhood, and the elderly. Now, I'll take you through some examples which you may or may not be aware of. So the difference between the genders arises at puberty. It's largely due to testosterone. There's a bit of an effect of estradiol as well. So hemoglobin and urate rise in boys at puberty because of testosterone. The same doesn't happen with urate. Other changes in childhood, there are growth spurts in the skeleton, so the toddler growth spurt and the pubertal growth spurt, which occurs at different ages in boys and girls. The growth spurts have different effects in calcium and phosphate in the toddler and in the puberty. Hemoglobin and creatinine rise linearly with age, and that's to do with exercise. The more active children become, the more muscle they get and the more hemoglobin they require. Similarly, the higher CO2s they get and the higher bicarb they get, and because you get a higher bicarb, you have a higher sodium across childhood. Metabolism changes in pregnancy as you get that fatty, the plump child ready for the growth spurt. And then cholesterol changes at puberty when HDL, more testosterone drops HDL in men. And the immune system changes enormously across childhood. I can't even begin to understand or describe that. What about pregnancy? Pregnancy is not one state. It's not even 3 states like trimesters. Unfortunately, pregnancy doesn't change every 3 months. It changes continuously. And as an example, in alkaline phosphatase, which I used to think rises in pregnancy because of placental lactose, in the first 2 trimesters, it falls because of the hemodilution. And it's only in the late second trimester and the 3rd trimester that it rises linearly. And you can't say that there's one level in the 3rd trimester. There's a level in the early, mid, and late 3rd trimester. So to describe it as trimesters is also misleading. And adults in general change. So we saw the changes in CK across puberty. Here are the changes in calcium and bicarbonate across puberty and alkaline phosphatase. So there are so many changes. Now, when you consider all of that, now the CLSI standard says you need at least 120 people in a reference interval study. What, 120 neonates, infants, children, puberts, or young adults, middle-aged, postmenopausal, first trimester, second trimester, postpartum, lactate? You're going to end up with needing thousands of people to establish reference intervals for all of these things. So that's what I'm saying. It's impossible to do, not only for laboratories, but for most manufacturers as well. That's let alone from the other reasons you might partition, like AM and PM and diet and ethnicity and geographic location. Here's an example. TSH is lower in the afternoon and higher around midnight. But we don't tell anybody to only be tested in the morning, even though there are huge differences in the reference intervals. Kiyoshi Ishihara has done a number of global studies here. This one in the Asian region found that, yes, there are things that vary between genders. There are things that vary with age. There are things that vary between cities, depending on, socioeconomic status and diet. There are things that vary with BMI. There are things that vary with alcohol consumption. There are things that vary with diet, like eating fish or even eating fruit. And George Dombrowski, using the NAINS data, showed that ALT reference intervals depend on waist circumference or obesity. So in most countries, particularly Europe, America, and Australia, there's a very high prevalence of overweight and obesity, and it affects our reference intervals. And that's why I published this cheeky editorial in Clinical Chemistry that talked about weighing up our confidence in reference interval, at least until everyone is overweight and obese. Now, so it is virtually impossible to select a small number of healthy individuals that represent biological diversity. Nevertheless, if we go through the IFCC recommendations, which are the CLSI recommendations for how to establish reference interval, you have to consider all the sources of biological variability and the partitioning criteria, as we've discussed. You need to get a written consent and get a questionnaire to try to find underlying disease. So it's no different whether you're doing direct or indirect intervals. The first step in establishing a apparently healthy population is to look for underlying disease. And you can do that either by clinical history examination or questionnaire, or by doing tests, other tests on the patients. So the questionnaire is designed to uncover information about disease and states known to affect tests under investigation. In the CLSI standard, there's a questionnaire there which covers all of those things. Now, I don't know what you do with all of that information. Do you partition? But at least you should make sure that these factors aren't major modifying factor for the analytes that you are testing. So we really know all of the things that affect blood tests. These are a great set of books for the ACC. Unfortunately, I don't think they're in print anymore, but they list so many things. There's 5 pages of diseases that affect sodium. There's 10 pages of drugs that affect sodium. There's a page of herbs and natural products that affect sodium. And there's 6 pages of pre-analytical factors that affect sodium. So you can easily look them up if you're not sure of them. And then you need to prepare a subject in a way that limits those variations. But when we look at reference interval studies, at least in 2004, they usually accounted for age, gender, and rarely in pregnancy in obstetric hospitals. And very rarely did I look at the effect of contraceptives or exercise or medications or alcohol and so on. I think smoking, CEA reference intervals do have smoking. So, we do very poorly at looking at all those sources of variation. So how do we know who's healthy? We've done our questionnaire. They think they're healthy. They're not on any medication, so they must be healthy. These are the illnesses that we're looking for in our questionnaire, whether in hospitals or there are surgery, whether medications. Now, I'll give you an example. We did a reference interval study on testosterone many years ago, and we examined the patient, took their history, measured their testicular volume, their weight, height, weight, and in the history, we looked at all these things. And of the 147 people we got, 11 of them had disease that was unknown. So we're left with 136. And then we did semen analysis, and 12 more had low sperm counts, which is suggestive that they could have low testosterone levels. And so the 136 fell to 124. So in the end, 23 of our apparently healthy 147 were excluded because of subclinical disease. And that's you'll find that everywhere you look, particularly in the West, that underlying disease is present in around 15 to 60% of the population. In this study, in a wellness setting, low ferritin in women, very common, dysglycemia, hypertriglyceridemia, fatty liver, subclinical thyroid disease. So unless you test for it, you won't even realize that the patient's got it. So how many do we need? 120. So 120 gives us a certain amount of confidence. If we do more, we'll have more confidence in our reference limit. It's like a standard error of the mean. So, but what if the population's skewed? The upper reference limit will vary. If we only had 120, the upper reference interval can vary a lot because that outlier at the highest skew can vary enormously. The lower end doesn't vary by as much. So really, for skewed intervals, the recommendation is that you probably need 400 to 800, not 100, to define a non-parametric reference interval in particular. So the 120 is the minimum required to define a 90% confidence limit, and that lies between the first and the 7th results. So just explaining that. So here's 120 patients. The lowest 7 contains the lower reference limit at 4, and the confidence interval between 1 and 7. At the other end, 117 is your upper reference limit, and the confidence limit is between 114 and 120. That's the non-parametric approach. And that gives you 90% confident. If you want to have more than 90% confidence, then you need either 153 or 198 in your sample group. And as I said, many hundreds if the sample's skewed. And people did try that by experiment to look at whether the reference intervals by iterative means were tighter. And they found that, generally you needed around 200 before the confidence intervals were minimized, which is pretty close to that theoretical 198 for 99% confidence. Now, the non-parametric method gives you quite wide confidence intervals. There is a method from Horn and Pesky called the robust method, which relies more on an iterative median and spread around the median absolute deviation. And I haven't got time to discuss it, but recently there was a paper from China that looked at how well the different methods occur when you have 6,000 reference intervals. And they fortunately did exclude obesity in their reference intervals. And so when they looked at the reference intervals by parametric or log transformed parametric, non-parametric or robust methods, what they found was that the parametric confidence intervals got narrower until you got to about 500, and then they were fairly constant. But the non-parametric confidence intervals, they were always wider, and you probably needed to get up to 1,000 before you had confidence intervals that approached parametric methods. Now, outliers, you can just look at the data and see whether something's an outlier, or you can provide various outlier detection limits, which again, I haven't got time to discuss, but effectively it's looking to see with respect to the central part of the distribution, how far the data is away. Now, once you've got a reference interval and you want to, somebody's defined one, say the manufacturer or some reference interval study in your country, and you want to work out whether you should adopt it in your laboratory because you don't have the time to do all of the things that we discussed. So is it suitable for adoption? There are two things you need to say. Is the method used in my laboratory suitable for that reference interval? And is the population served by my laboratory suitable for that reference interval? The method and the population. So that's what the standard says. You can transfer a reference interval to your laboratory if the analytical system is comparable and the test subject population is comparable. Now, if they are comparable and the correlation between the methods is very high, you can either just modify, like here the method used in the laboratory is 57% higher than the one used in the method, but there was a very high correlation. So if you just multiplied the 50 by 57% roughly, you got 77 as a cutoff, which was 78. So they could convert the 50 to 150 reference interval to 78 to 235 because they had so much confidence in the analysis. Now, Mario Pantaghini and Ferio Chiriotti, who really focused on traceable methods, ideally methods should be, if methods were traceable, then we could just adopt reference intervals. So is the reference interval described properly? Did they use QC properly? Did they describe their analytical performance? And was it traceable? If those are all true, then you should accept that the method is comparable. Unfortunately, many tests aren't traceable, but even if we could harmonize, sharing reference interval data might be more reliable. So now validation in the CLSI standard, they talk about validation, and I'll come back to that. There's a difference between validation and verification. It's a little bit confusing in the standard, but there's three ways to validate a reference interval for use in your laboratory. One's a subjective approach, one's using 20 reference individuals, and another one's is doing a half a reference interval study. Now, recently, Yasim Azada and Victoria Higgins-Kozra, distinguished this issue. So verification means confirmation, whereas validation means confirmation according to making sure that the specific intended use or applications have been filled. So validation is really to do with manufacturers. So manufacturers validate reference intervals and laboratories verify those reference intervals for use in the laboratory. So when a laboratory transfers to receive an RA from somewhere else, they're verifying. So, really we are dependent on manufacturers doing that. And, 1977, many years, 50 years ago, people were saying, really it seemed mandatory that manufacturers should do these validate these reference interval studies and allow for diurnal variation, seasonal age changes, and all of the other things that are significant. But, frankly, they don't, because it's too big a job. So even more recently, in clinical chemistry, they said it's important the regulatory require not only reference intervals in disease-free subjects, but also reference intervals that include predefined conditions, such as pregnancy and even diabetes and those common things. Do they affect the test? So verification rather than validation. Subjective verification. To be able to do this, all the reference population, demographic and geographically must be adequately described. If you can be sure that that population is the same as yours by the description that you were given, then you've done one step. Then secondly, the pre-analytical and analytical needs to be completely described. If the laboratorian or the director is confident that the demographic variables and the pre-analytical analytical variables were described, then you can transfer the intervals. But to be honest, you seldom have the confidence in what was the reference population and exactly how did the assay performed at the time of the reference interval study, even in kit inserts. Very difficult to do subjective verification. So, those three approaches. What are that subjective approach? That's what Westgard called divine judgment. It's like it must be magical the way you could define that. Requires the appropriate signature, like the directors but it does mean careful investigation of the published, access to the appropriate information, and the significance of laboratory and medical expertise to work out whether those things are truly comparable. The second way is to just take 20 reference individuals, so 20 apparently healthy people, and that can be 20 outpatients who are apparently healthy. And if 18 of those fall inside the reference interval, then according to this statistic, everything's okay. Now, again, recently in that paper by Ozada and Adeli, they sort of pointed out that there's a bit more to it. You take the 20, make sure there are no outliers there and get rid of them first, and then test them. And if there's less than 20, that's fine. But what if there's 3 or 4? Well, get another 20 and see how it works. What if it's but if it's greater than 5, don't get another 20. That's just completely wrong. There's another very good paper on transfers and validation from Jill Tate, who is very sad, people don't know, passed away in the last few years, and Tina and Graham Jones, who discussed all of the things you should take in place. Now, I'm not going to discuss all those, but in general terms, what are the steps? Well, you check analysis. Look at the assay. Is your assay biased? Look at EQA, look at other method comparison studies. And you can't use the reference interval if the analytical specificity or the calibrations are different. You can do a comparison study using a proper procedure like CLSI EPO 0903. Make sure you have samples across the reference interval and define what you mean by bias. But if the correlation's worse than 0.7, well, then you're kidding yourself if you think that the methods are comparable. And then in the validation, with the reference population, you can either do the 20 and 2 outside. You can do data mining of your own laboratory data. And don't use if there's too high a flag rate. It's very much like a partitioning question. So the third method was this, using a large number of reference interval. Now, the CLSI states that if you can validate one partition, you may not need to verify the other partitions. So if you can verify men, you don't have to verify women and pregnancy and children. But how do you know that the measured analyte and matrix issues are the same in all partitions? Therefore, although it might be operationally impractical to verify all partition reference intervals, verifying each partition provides the most confidence. Now I'm going to finish with some discussion about the indirect approach, which is being considered in the new CLSI standard for verification, but can be used for defining reference interval, the indirect method. So if you grab laboratory data, as Azadeh and these German co-workers did many years ago, you can easily see where the reference interval for potassium is, and you can probably work out that those long tails are due to disease. So you just need a statistical method to try to work out where that reference interval is. The other way of looking at it is if you apply a reference interval and you look at the flagging rate in apparently healthy people, like outpatients, then, if the sodium flag rate is, so here the sodium flag rate for this method was a bit higher than the 4.1%, remember we were talking about before? So when it's over 4.1%, it's flagging not consistent with the 2.5% flag rate. Or if it's flagging below 0.9%, then again, your flag rate is too low for that reference interval. So you can either look at the distributions or look at the flag rate to get a quick test of whether the reference interval is appropriate to your apparently healthy populations. Now, the indirect methods have, huge advantages because, the patients you've got are the patients you'll investigate are the patients you have. You don't need to define health, you just define apparently healthy people like outpatients. The costs are very low. You can repeat it in different locations, all the locations your laboratory serves. You can repeat it whenever you change your method. The only disadvantages is that you really do need to know the statistical strengths and weaknesses. And there are some, until we develop truly objective methods, there are some subjective traps in this method. So the IFCC published a paper on the minimum requirements for indirect reference intervals. And they include many of the things that direct reference intervals require, as well as other things like, how did you define that reference population? How did you exclude disease and so on? And now, how many do you need? Generally, you need thousands to improve the confidence of a reference interval from an indirect approach. But in the large laboratories nowadays, we do have thousands of patients' results. And how do you exclude disease? Well, clinically, you can look for clinical history and examination. So do you know anything about these patients in your database? Do they have other tests which are abnormal? They've probably got disease. And then there's statistical strategies, so including transformations and so on. Now, just in terms of, how because people really struggle with trying to understand how you can use laboratory data to define reference intervals. Here's an example of what you can do. This is quite an old study, but if you grab all the patients for this particular test in your database, and there's 166,000, you make sure that every patient has 23 tests so that you can work out from their other tests whether they're sick or not. Okay, now, you've lose 31,000. Then then you say you only want patients who've only been to the laboratory once, because the patients who've been to the laboratory many times are probably sick. And then in those patients you've only seen once, do they have any abnormal results in those other tests? Well, get rid of them as well. And you can see that, you might have started off with 200,000, but you end up with 60,000. So you can afford to do that. You can afford to get rid of most of your data to be more confident that what you've got left is relatively healthy. Now, it's important to get rid of patients between multiple results because, the chances of a repeat test increases exponentially the more abnormal your results are. A recent paper from Arzadeh's group again shows that, if you look at all results, the reference interval you defined are quite wide. But if you look at the last result or the first result, or only patients without repeats, only patients with one result, that's when you get the narrowest interval. And it affects the upper reference interval more than the lower reference interval here for alkaline phosphatase. Note the menopausal change. So there are ways that we can do. We can say, trim the data, whatever the information we've got in our database, only use patients without repeats, go to outpatients, whatever. Now, there's a recent paper in the Journal of Laboratory Medicine that really discusses indirect approaches. If you want to keep me up to date, you just have to read 2 or 3 of these papers. And it's being used everywhere. And Jacob Zierk's group in Germany is really applying it in the third world. So in countries, even in Pakistan, we can see that serum creatinine rises in childhood, according to an indirect determination from the databases in those Pakistani laboratories, and is giving exactly the same, pretty well the same results as direct studies or the Teats textbook in boys and in girls. So this approach can be easily adopted in laboratories in resource-constrained countries, and the reference intervals generated would provide more accurate comprehension of laboratory reports in order to facilitate care. Jacob's got a particular interest in pediatrics, so here's a whole lot of pediatric data. You can look at 6-year-olds, look at their reference distribution, work out where the reference interval is, and then work out, like a growth curve, what the reference interval should be. And as I showed before, creatinine rises linearly with childhood as they become more active and grow muscle. And you don't need a direct study to prove that. And it's very hard to prove with a direct study, as the years and years of research that Adeli and co at Caliper work to do. Some more age and sex distributions for alkaline phosphatase and hemoglobin in children. You can even search for patients' names to see which names are Turkish and work out whether the Turkish reference intervals in Germany are different to the German reference intervals. So it's only limited by the amount of data you've got and your imagination and time. Now, there are some more, the latest approaches to indirect reference intervals are this Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance or COSMIC approach, and there's a website that you can just download your data into, and it'll do all of this automatically and give you the reference interval, the underlying reference interval. In the investigation, they found that you really need to try to limit the number of disease to less than 20% of the population. And it won't work if your disease population has a median close to the normal population. And just finally, in this regard, Jacob Zierk have defined an even more advanced method of trying to define that central interval by looking at that central curve and then trying to deconvolute the disease and so on. So the method can be used in homogeneous populations, but there's a warning. Many reference intervals are age dependent or vary according to other covariates like sex and ethnicity. So unless you look for that up front, you might miss it when you're doing indirect reference intervals. So determining reference intervals remain complex, time-consuming, and costly. They cannot be readily transferred because they are dependent on the analytical systems at the time and the reference intervals for which they determine. It's impossible, but we're stuck with them. It's a necessary evil. So in summary, please don't use the term normal range. I get very sad when people use it because they're like 30 years out of date. The Gaussian distribution is the dominant assumption in defining the reference population distribution, especially for the quettalists. Reference intervals are concerned with an apparently healthy population, while clinical decision limits support specific decisions relating to a diseased population. An understanding of physiology is required when defining reference intervals, especially to identify the overlapping partitions. Reference interval determinations or verification is an ideal aspiration and is seldom, if ever, resourced to address the diversity of human physiology. It doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to do it, but it's almost impossible to do. Indirect data mining approaches to reference interval verification and defining and establishing reference intervals address that real-world problem with real-world data, and that really is the way of the future. So here are some publications which I've mentioned and could consider. And here are some questions that you might test yourself on to see whether you've understood anything that I've said. So thank you very much for your time.